qualifiers, and it's time to talk about Yelawolf's new album, Trial by Fire. Now, I have been a fan of Yelawolf since he released his first mixtape, Trunk Music, which I thought had some songs with a lot of real emotional honesty on them. He displayed some great storytelling and a knack for writing some really tight, catchy melodies. He did disappoint me a little bit with his big commercial debut album, Radioactive, which I thought was kind of formulaic and pretty underwhelming. But I was intrigued and sort of impressed with what he did on his next big commercial project, Love Story. This album was pretty flawed. It was very overlong. Some of the writing seemed a little simplistic, and the production was too slick and polished for its own good. It sounded a little bit more pop country than the organic, authentic type of country music I would expect Yelawolf to sound good over. But on this album, Yelawolf displayed real talent for crafting these alluring, seductive choruses, which had great melodies and set a really good tone, and his husky voice worked really well over them. It sounded weathered and full of experience and kind of melancholy, and I could suddenly imagine him as a country musician. And I think on this new album, we kind of get the best of both worlds. We get some of the more alluring, smoky, and bluesy choruses that were on Love Story, combined with the very engrossing, detail-oriented, narrative rapping that Yelawolf showed off on some of his earlier tapes, except now it's even sharper and more captivating. I think that in a lot of ways, this album probably sounds more experimental and genre-bending in concept than it actually is in practice, because even though you do get a lot of elements of country-related organic instrumentation on these beats, you get finger-picked guitars on almost every beat here, you get fiddle and mandolin woven into the mix. These beats do primarily serve to support and add atmosphere to Yelawolf's rapping and his storytelling. The country instrumentation or the country influence never overtakes any of these songs. There aren't any fiddle solos here. Instead, structurally, what you get is an album that is very reminiscent of an old school rap record with a verse, a hook, and another verse where the rapper continues telling the story. And add to that Yelawolf's clearly 90s inspired flow, which really does remind me of Eminem, and you get an album that, despite the country accents, is pretty easy to understand as an old school rap album with a little bit of a twist. And at least initially, a lot of the stories he tells on this album feel pretty familiar because they're topics and themes that rap has dealt with for decades, and they're narratives that most people are familiar with. They are almost myths because we tell them so many times and in so many different ways. For example, the story of the artist coming up from nothing, the story of the parent who would do anything and sacrifice anything for their children. These are pretty common stories of struggle and redemption in rap music that have fed a lot of its mythos, a lot of its ideology. So the fact that Yelawolf is doing them doesn't seem very creative or original in a way. It seems to be another old school aspect of this record. But what really elevates Yelawolf above his rap contemporaries who are dealing with a lot of the same themes is his grasp on storytelling as a craft. He is great at establishing character, establishing setting, building suspense, rationing out and sectioning out a story in a way that makes sense, in a way that each new installment, each new verse reveals something new. And his command of the basics of storytelling make some of his simplest and seemingly most boring or overdone premises the most interesting and gripping songs on this entire album. A good example of him doing this really well, I think, is on the song Sabrina, which is just one verse of him rapping furiously. Incredibly good technical rapping here. about all of the thoughts going through the mind of a father when he wakes up and can't find his daughter one day. The rising panic, the anger that she's hiding somewhere, and finally the horrifying realization that she is drowned in the pool in the backyard. It really is like something out of a Stephen King novel, out of a horror short story. And even though it is kind of one note, he captures that one note perfectly. And because this isn't a very complex story, because he's not building up information about the father's past or his personality or his daughter's personality, he has to be able to create this moment in a way that's specific enough that it feels real, but still universal enough that we can all relate to it, that anybody could essentially be this father character. And that's really the secret to the good storytelling on this album, is Yelawolf takes these grand universal themes that have this kind of sweeping power to them because they incorporate ideas like suffering with a capital S and triumph with a capital T. And then he adds enough detail to make them feel really real. And I think that on his best songs on this album, he takes a big grand idea and kind of puts his own unique spin on it. Like, I really like the song Violin, which is about people who have been screwed over in some way by either a system or a person and essentially manipulated into doing something that they don't want to do, and it plays with that phrase, play me like a violin. And obviously there have been countless songs about feeling screwed over and manipulated, but what makes this one different is that Yelawolf is elevating this idea to kind of this grand sweeping scale and comparing these different instances that may not seem similar at first to make a bigger philosophical point. For example, he talks about a soldier in the first verse who feels manipulated by the romantic stories the army has told him into signing up to go fight only to get PTSD when he comes back home, and a wife who gets manipulated in a similar way by her abusive husband. And then finally he makes it a little bit more personal, going back to himself and saying that even though he feels like he is partially to blame for his own problems with addiction and the fact that he has never really escaped some of the trauma of growing up poor, he feels like there is a greater system at work which is playing him, that it isn't all his own doing. And I'm also interested in the subtext of this song, which I think comes through in Yelawolf's constant references to art, references to the people or the systems who manipulate other people as artists who lure their victims in by talking about beautiful things and even create music with the people who they have exploited. They play them like violins. And to me, what I'm getting from this, and I'm not sure if it's what Yelawolf was intending, is a commentary on the way that people tend to narrativize certain things in a romantic or an idealistic or an oversimplified way. And when we do that, we tend to involve people who might not want to buy into that story, might not want to be a part of that story. For example, one thing that Yelawolf kind of subtly references here is the stories that countries tell about patriotism, portraying soldiers as these martyrs who beautifully sacrifice themselves for their countries, when in fact soldiers might not want this to be idolized. They might not want to be involved in the creation of this myth, of this message. And yet they are part of this story, and this story in turn causes the exploitation of other soldiers. It's an interesting cycle, and even though this song doesn't really discuss it directly, I think that it's pretty rich and nuanced in its subtext, in its implication. I do feel like Yelawolf maybe could have provided just a little bit more specificity on each verse here, but because he is trying to sum up each person's experience in just one verse, he doesn't have very much room. I can understand why this song might read a little bit broad. It really reminds me, though, of a lot of the stuff that Lupe Fiasco was doing in the early 2000s, songs like Intruder Alert, where he was able to tackle a bigger topic and make connections between seemingly unrelated situations. The song Shadows also has a great thematic arc. It starts out by viscerally detailing all of the things that disturbed Yelawolf and made him uncomfortable and scared as a kid and as a teenager. And then in the last verse reveals that he himself, both in the way he looks, being completely tattooed, and in the way he behaves, getting drunk, getting into bar fights, has become one of the people that he felt disturbed and scared and weirded out by when he was a kid, and the fear that maybe his own kids will sometimes be afraid of him if they see him drunk or something like that. It's a really well done song thematically, and I also love the fiddle and the cello and the mandolin that are all woven in to make a eerie sounding, beautiful, and atmospheric chorus. I really love the use of organic instrumentation on these songs, especially on the choruses, because Yelawolf's rapping, it is direct. There are usually characters, and there is usually a setting, and there is usually some kind of point that he's trying to make, which is usually not very subtle. So these choruses coming in and feeling bluesy and folksy and old and kind of mysterious with fingerpick guitar weaving in and out of these keening violins and cellos adds a dimension to this album which lends it a lot more subtle and abstract beauty than it would otherwise have. It also gives these songs a feeling of timelessness, of tapping into something that is older than Yelawolf himself, sort of a sense of struggle or weariness or just the ins and outs and hardships and ups and downs of life, which come through in the best blues songs, in Johnny Cash, which he's clearly inspired by. If I was going to take issue with the instrumentation on any part of this album, and mostly it's pretty great, it would have to be on the verses. A lot of these beats sound very similar. Most of them incorporate a finger-picked guitar and a programmed drum machine, and the repetitiveness of the drum machine and of the guitar picking often feels a little bit stiff, and I do get that it is important to have a kind of minimalist and rhythmic beat for Yelawolf to rap over because he has such a propulsive flow, such a rhythmic flow. But I do feel like when compared with some of the more organic, more supple, more flowing instrumentation on the choruses, it's a little bit of an awkward shift, and I think that adding in just a little bit more organic instrumentation onto these verses could have really gone a long way. My only other minor complaint with this album is that sometimes the songs, especially the song structures, can get a little bit samey. There's usually a verse where Yelawolf starts telling a story, which has a pretty minimalist beat behind it. Then you get a swell of instrumentation, the incorporation of maybe some violins or some backing vocals to lead into a big cathartic chorus, and then it goes back to a verse again. There isn't very much variety in the way the songs are composed, which means that I do tend to get a little bit tired listening to this whole album all at once. Overall, I thought this album was really good. It wasn't especially groundbreaking or experimental. In fact, it was pretty traditional and old school, but I have a lot of respect for people who take an established craft and do it really well, continue on the traditions of their forebearers. And I think that's what Yelawolf is doing. It sounds like Eminem, yeah, it sounds like Lupe Fiasco, yeah, but both of those artists are really good. So I'm going to give this a solid 7 out of 10, and a recommendation. Check it out. It knows exactly what it is, and it does that really well. Plus, there's a ton of great, evocative, and visceral storytelling by Yelawolf in here. Next up, I'm not totally sure what's gonna come next. I'm considering reviewing the Tovlo album. I'm considering reviewing the Avi Tear album that dropped a couple of months ago. I'm pretty impressed with that. But I don't know. So if you have any recommendations, put them in the comments below and I'll check them out.